This is ContraZoom.
映画のあれこれについて触れるポッドキャストです。
I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault, and today's episode is presented by Aesthetic Magazine. On today's episode, we are continuing our celebration of cinema from around the world. If you weren't able to ascertain from the intro, on this episode we are talking about Japanese cinema. Japan has a long and rich history with their contribution to the fabric of film. Japan was one of the earliest countries outside of America to be introduced to movies way back in 1896, only 2 years after Thomas Edison premiered his kinetoscope and the Lumiere brothers' invention, which was shown only a year later in 1897. Because of Japan's history with the magic lantern, a precursor to moving pictures, Japan was an early adopter to making movies and had its first film premiere in 1897. Since then, they have given the world some of the greatest filmmakers ever, including the likes of Akira Kurosawa, Yasujirō Ozu, Kenji Mizoguchi, Hayao Miyazaki, Hirokazu Koreeda, Takeshi Miike, and Isao Takahata, to name just a small number. Today, we are going to do our best to celebrate the vast wealth of movies from Japan, and joining me on this journey is Naomi Wada Platt, a film and culture YouTuber who makes videos in both English and Japanese. She previously guested on episode 130, imagineNATIVE, and provided a voicemail for her favorite film of 2020 and our best of show. Welcome back, Naomi, and thank you for helping me with the intro.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad that I get to help you with, adding some diversity and whatever to your show, which is already amazing.
Yeah, it was so much fun. I'm glad we were able to do this together. Before we start and get into this huge, big discussion, I want to know a bit about your history with Japanese cinema. What movies did you grow up with, and did you have any favorites?
So the truth is, I grew up in a household where I was taught that the Japanese films in the 90s and early 2000s are basically really bad. But my dad, being a Canadian-born white man who loved Kurosawa, he kept telling me, Naomi, you're too young to understand Kurosawa. When you hit your 20s, we will watch it together. So I grew up watching some anime adaptation, live action films that are really not that great. But yeah, it was really bad. But I actually do love Late Spring. I think that's the only film that my father let me watch when I was young. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really nice. Like, Japan used to make good movies.
Yeah, that was one that was high up on my list as well. And that didn't bore you as a kid? You're invested in the story because not a lot really happens in it.
Yeah, but it reminded me of my grandfather a lot. And at that time I thought, okay, when I, become an adult, I will get married and I will have this kind of conversation with my father or my grandfather. So it kept me engaging, and my father kind of pressured me to enjoy it. Like, he was sitting right next to me and he's like kind of staring at me like, are you liking it? Are you liking it? So I was like, yes, father. Yes.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
One of the inspirations of wanting to cover this topic was an article that was published by the British Film Institute last year, naming the best Japanese film from every year from 1925 onwards. And as I went through the list, I realized I'd only seen 3 of the close to 100 films listed, 2 Kurosawas, and 1 recent Best Foreign Language Film nominee. And I realized I needed to rectify that. When I brought this idea of this topic in the article to you, what were your thoughts on it?
I love it because, like I said, I really have limited knowledge of Japanese film. I only know the Golden Age films, and even in school, I did take some film studies classes. Actually, no, I only took 1 film classes that I nearly failed, and I actually majored in East Asian studies, so I often talked about or touched on Japanese media. So I was like, this is a great opportunity to update my knowledge and revisit Japanese cinema as in current situation or current environment, because I actually have many friends who are or were in film industries in Japan. So it's just like perfect. It ties my whole life into one podcast episode, and I get to just learn more and polish my knowledge. So I really appreciate it.
Interesting. Do you find either Japanese people living in Canada or the people that you know back in Japan, is there a strong knowledge and respect for the history of the cinema, or is it something that is a little more on the periphery of society?
They do definitely have the history of Japanese film in their mind for sure, but it's more like, we used to be great, now not so much. And they want to tackle that, but they can't. That's why some of them come to Canada. Some of them are still trying there, but it's a hard fight.
Interesting.
To fight.
Okay. Now I figured we'd do our best to kind of try to chronologically talk about the history of Japanese movies, but you can't really talk about Japan and really any part of its history without dividing it into essentially two eras, pre-World War II and post. Unfortunately for film historians and cinephiles, almost every movie made before World War II was lost. But that was, a combination of factors, which was, a devastating earthquake on the island of Honshu in 1923, the tragic atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the general volatility of early nitrate film reels, which sort of combined for almost everything pre-1945 to forever be lost. Sadly, that means that we don't have the ability to personally share much of any kind of thoughts of super early Japanese cinema, but we can talk about two of the greatest directors pre-war and what was to come in the post-war industry. Obviously, the directors whose work spanned both pre- and post-war was Yasujirō Ozu and Kenji Mizoguchi, and they set the stage of what was to come to define early Japanese cinema. It was slow, methodical storytelling that is often grounded in reality and very relatable characters. Ozu's films were more about everyday people, while Mizoguchi often made his films as parables. What was your exposure to these two masters and how they helped shape Japan's image both internally and internationally?
So actually, Ozu is my favorite Japanese director. I'm sorry, Kurosawa. Ozu is my man. So I watched Late Spring when I was young, but I rewatched Late Spring in my film studies class at U of T, and I remember the TA and the students being so confused as to why the daughter is always just so obedient. And I realized, oh, I am her, but at the same time, I am also the audience, because I know what those movies signify, where it came from. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yeah, girls are obedient, everyday life, slice of everyday life, but kind of dramatic in a way that, not in a way as in like action or whatever, but it enhances their emotion. Mm-hmm. And so I do see that. And as a Canadian side of me saying, yeah, that is very unique. It is beautiful on its own, and it should be cherished. So I do have the dilemma, and I feel like I'm kind of not answering your question, but
no, that's fine. And I managed to watch two Ozu films. One of them was Late Spring, and the other one was Tokyo Story. And they, he sort of tread a lot of the same ground. This sort of family dynamics and these sort of micro events, which on the larger scale mean a lot more. In Late Spring, mm-hmm. It's this idea of a widowed father pressuring his adult daughter to be married so that way she can move on with her life and leave home and things like that. But she doesn't want to leave him because he's a fussy old man, and if she's not there to take care of him, no one will. And so it's all these really small interactions where she's the one that's there to kind of help with the food and help with tidying up after him while he's still doing his work as a professor, I believe he is. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a very small, interesting dynamic, the relationship between the two of them. And I wish I had them in front of me. I'm going to pull it up, and I'll probably end up butchering their names. But the two actors that played this father and daughter were just so fantastic. And when I watched Tokyo Story the next week, and they pop up mm-hmm. in that again, playing slightly different characters, where she is his daughter-in-law this time. Mm-hmm. Once again, the two of them just pulled through and really shined through as being such strong actors, and despite not really being, loud or overly emotional, they give so much to the camera, and you really help to connect with them.
The actress, the name is Hara Setsuko. She is legendary for sure. I remember seeing her face like whenever there were shows about like Japanese cinema or where are those actors, and I remember seeing them and I'm like, she's pretty and she's talented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she has a bit of a unique look to her where I don't want to say she looks plain, but she definitely has a look of, she doesn't have your typical cinema glamour, but she still is very pretty in that same sense. And I think that helps make her more relatable as a character, where it's not like, oh, she's this, super hyper beautiful woman, where, you look at maybe some of the other characters in Tokyo Story where there are more, I don't want to say conventionally attractive, but more not Hollywood, but more cinema glamorous sort of style to their looks, but she still stands out. She just has a very unique style and sensibility to her that I was very drawn to her performances.
Fun fact about her, apparently she's been called the eternal virgin by people.
Interesting.
For some reason. Yeah.
She does have a bit of youthfulness to her look, so maybe that's why? I don't know.
Yeah. I'm like, is that a compliment? Or they don't give any reasons why, but
now, I was only able to watch one Mizoguchi film, and that was Ugetsu. Do you have any sort of thoughts on his style of filmmaking, which definitely seems to be more about telling a grander tale than Ozu, certainly, who never moves his camera and only has one style of shot where it's low to the ground?
I knew that he is known for like being a perfectionist and really realistic. I do remember seeing, Ugetsu. I think I watched it way back when, but I don't remember much because I have immense knowledge in Japanese literature. That's what I'm really passionate about. So Ugetsu's original story, Ugetsu Monogatari story, but Ugetsu, I kept going back to that instead of watching the film and appreciating it. So I feel bad for Mizoguchi, and I feel like he's gonna curse me and appear in my dream tonight.
That kind of sounds like the plot of it. Yeah. So I guess you should be worried about that. You'll accidentally get married to a ghost.
You never know.
So after those two directors, there are two other landmark entities. One is a director and one is a franchise, and they both involve the movie studio Toho. There were two films that came out in 1954 that nearly bankrupted the studio, but instead of making them go under, you had Seven Samurai, directed by Akira Kurosawa, and the original Godzilla, directed by Yasujirō Ozu, that became two of the most profitable films ever made in Japan and turned the studio into the powerhouse that still is today. For Kurosawa, it was already his 14th film, and he had previously directed the classics like Ikaru in 1952 and Rashomon from 1950, which actually won an honorary Oscar in 1952 for the most outstanding foreign language film released in the United States. And that was before there was even a foreign language or international film category at the Oscars. Godzilla was inspired by the King Kong movies in the United States, but instead of the movie just being another creature feature, it was made as a reaction to the use of nuclear power and the devastating bombings during the war. The film has a powerful allegory of nature getting its revenge on all the toxic waste that the bombings created and can continue to create if the world kept unleashing these weapons. These two films could not be more different, with Seven Samurai taking place in the 1500s and being inspired by American westerns, and as such inspiring just about every western afterwards, about a group of samurai who band together to protect a village from bandits. It's action-packed, funny, meditative, and brutal all at the same time. Godzilla might be one of the most impressive monster films ever made, though, as the general populace's fear post-World War II is on full display with some very impressive practical effects that could be just as influential to Hollywood as Seven Samurai was. Would you agree that those two movies are probably the 1 and 1A pillars of building Japanese cinema, and sort of what were your experiences with them?
Oh, for sure. I mean, Samurai, Shinin and Samurai, the original title, shaped this world of Japanese cinema and made his name known in the world and the existence of Japanese cinema for sure. And Godzilla, I actually didn't realize how important the original Godzilla is until I took a class about Japanese monsters, and the prof said, "Yeah, Godzilla is just a metaphor for America." And I sat there and I went, "Wow," because Godzilla is now so commercialized in Japan. I grew up with it and I thought it's just another, scary monster. So I do definitely agree, as in Kurosawa becoming a household name and Godzilla shaping this whole new genre of, it's called tokusatsu in Japanese. It's kind of superhero slash monster films or television series. So I definitely do see why you chose those two, and they are definitely important.
Seven Samurai for me was always, as I was getting into film, one of the all-time classics of you must watch this to really be a film lover or a cinephile, whatever you want to call yourself. And it was just one where I felt like it was such an intimidating film to get into. I was like, "Ooh, I don't know. It's like it's over 3 hours long." I didn't have a ton of experience watching Asian cinema as a young person. So it was, I don't want to call it a bit of a mental block, because I enjoyed watching, movies from France or Italy or Germany or wherever other countries where I was watching foreign language films at the time. And so it wasn't the idea of, it's Japanese, I can't watch it. It was just sort of like it was just a bit different for me, where it's like, I've never seen a Japanese movie. I don't know if I can get into it. And I'm like, it's a samurai movie, but it's not really, because I hear it's like such a intelligent film. And then I finally watched it. I'm like, this is a Hollywood blockbuster. Like,
it is.
It blew my mind.
People don't realize that.
Yeah, like the action scenes in it are so fantastic. And like in the end sequence where they're fighting in the mud and the rain and the horses are running by, it's just so intense and brutal at times. It's just so well done. I would put this up against almost any action war type movie, and it's one of the best at basically everything it does.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Oh, yeah. It was a few years ago, and it was funny. I was in New Orleans for my honeymoon, and there was a little stand that was selling hand-drawn prints, where it was this guy who would like making prints. Most of it was pop culture stuff, where it would be like either inspired by the poster or for scenes from it. And I saw one that was a picture from Seven Samurai. I was like, I have to buy this. So I bought that, and I still need to frame it and put it up on my wall. But like, that movie really resonated with me, and so it holds a special place in my heart now.
Oh, that's so great. I'm sure Kurosawa was like really happy in his grave hearing that.
I think the other crazy thing is, once you see Seven Samurai, you realize that this idea of a group of, soldiers, warriors, whatever it is, that this small group band together to help protect a small, poor village that's being attacked by outside forces, that's done in so many movies. Like A Bug's Life does it. The Mandalorian did an episode on it, which is, funny, where Kurosawa was inspired by Westerns, and then Westerns were later inspired by Kurosawa.
Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of like a never-ending feedback loop between the two of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was sort of shocked at just like how prominent that story is, where it seems like every sort of, TV show or movie genre has done their version of a Seven Samurai story.
For sure. I think one of the factors as to why this film is so well received is because Kurosawa is known as just doing everything he can to make his movies make his visions come true to life, come into life, and as in a form of film. And as I was reading some reviews or articles written in Japanese about Seven Samurai, Shinin no Samurai, and they kept saying like the final battle scene that you mentioned, Kurosawa really wanted to be realistic. Like everything had to be really realistic, as in the really accurate samurai fighting styles and how they lived. So I think his dedication to make as real as possible translated really well, and that dedication just shone through and made that movie amazing.
I think,
and I do.
I think the other thing that's very unique about it is, too oftentimes, like I'll use the example of of Game of Thrones, like the last season of that, where everyone was complaining about how it was too dark and you couldn't see anything that was going on in all these night sort of battles. I would hold something like Seven Samurai up as the ideal way to film a battle sequence, because despite the fact that it takes place in just about the hardest rain that I've ever seen in any movie, and they're fighting in the mud, and there's people, hiding in bushes and the trees, and things are on fire, you still at every single point know exactly who is doing what, who is still alive, who's died, where punches are landing, where bows are being shot into, where spears are being thrown, swords being used. Everything like that is still so clear, despite the fact that there's so many elements in a way that with, countless other directors, it just becomes a blur of, fists and steel sort of thing, and you can't tell one thing from another.
That is so true. I think one of the reasons that I really dislike Marvel, even though I love Marvel, and other action films, like when you see a fight scene in recent movies, it's, handheld camera, it's close-ups, cuts. And I just feel like I just want to sit down and look at the whole fight scene. And I think that expectation was born because of watching Seven Samurai or other Kurosawa films.
Yeah.
Because it's well made, it's well calculated, well staged.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one other thing is the performances in it are just so fantastic. You've got 7 samurai, and they all have such distinct personalities and characteristics. And obviously, it's headlined by Toshiro Mifune, who is probably Japan's greatest actor ever, and just absolutely steals every scene that he's in. Where he's this kind of playful rascal, and then basically grows up in this movie to be this hardened leader who you really do understand why everyone gets behind him.
The script is well written, characters are well developed. It is good. And actually, my parents, I think they ran into Mifune Toshiro in LA. I remember seeing a photo of them with Mifune, and I was like, is this the guy who I think it is? And my dad's like, yep, like really proud father he was. So whenever I see him, I'm like, yeah, my parents met him. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I know, I'm jealous.
And then obviously the other thing that we were just talking about there is Godzilla. And, I'm a big fan of it. It's taken me a long time to get into scary movies. We'll get into that a little bit later, my aversion to it. But so my entry into it is I love watching the old monster movies, especially the ones made by Universal in the 1930s, the Draculas and the mummies and that sort of stuff, where I sort of love it, where it's these creaky old practical effects and really gothic romance style. And so Godzilla was nice, where it's not stylistically similar to that, but the care that they put into developing this story and the backstory behind both the monster and every other person that's in it. Whereas I feel like today, a lot of the monster movies, they either focus, like the recent Godzilla movies, they either focus way too much on the characters or too much on the monster. And it's like you need to have that nice balance. And I don't think I've ever gotten as emotional and sad as I did when I first watched Godzilla, especially towards the end, where you really forge a connection with these people and you understand where their fear is of, using Godzilla as a substitute for nuclear war.
Godzilla, king of the monsters, alive, surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror to wreak vengeance on mankind.
Godzilla, king of the monsters, it's alive.
A gigantic beast,
stalking the earth, crushing all before it.
in a cyclonic cavalcade of electrifying horror.
Raging through the streets on a rampage of total destruction.
For sure. My grandfather, he was actually either in Hiroshima or near Hiroshima when the bomb hit. So nuclear bombs been something that's really kind of crucial in my family. So with that in my mind, that movie is just a bit too personal. And I loved the setup, that small fisher village. That for me is some parts of Japan that people outside of Japan don't really see. So to see that in a film and being widely appreciated, and I actually saw it for the first time in a class, and everyone's just like, "Oh my God, it's Godzilla! Like it's so cool!" And it was just like, "Yeah, y'all enjoying it? Yeah, this is it. This is the thing. Just don't watch recent Godzillas." So that one's the best. And any sequels? No, I'm not going to talk about that.
I'm not gonna lie. I really want that Criterion box set that has all the original Toho ones, because it's just such a beautiful packaging and everything.
Oh yeah.
So I definitely want that. I think it's very expensive. I think it's like $200, but I think it's got like the first 20 Toho Godzilla films.
Wow, 200's not that bad. Get it, just get it. I'm bad influence.
You are, because you know what? Maybe next Criterion sale I will.
Yeah.
Now, I sort of resisted the urge to not just completely binge watch every Kurosawa film in preparation for this episode, and instead sort of spread out the wealth, I guess, as a good cinephile. But so far, I've seen, Seven Samurai, as I mentioned, and Rashomon, as I talked about a little bit earlier, but also Yojimbo and Throne of Blood. And I can't wait to keep on going with his filmography. Do you have any other favorites of his, either the ones that I mentioned or other ones I didn't?
Actually, I've been avoiding Kurosawa because, as I mentioned earlier, my father promised me that he will watch Kurosawa films with me when I, become an adult. But he actually passed away when I was 19. So
I'm so sorry.
It's sorry that, and I didn't want to dampen the mood, but it's something that I really want to watch more and appreciate, because I've only seen Seven Samurai and Rashomon, those two, and I feel like I'm a failed Japan-born person because of that. But I definitely want to watch Kumo no Sujo, Throne of Blood, and Yojimbo, those you've seen, because I've heard those names so often and I know that they're good. So it's just like, I need to go. But for me, Seven Samurai and Rashomon, that represent Kurosawa.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, I got the good gist of it and I'm happy with that.
Yeah, those two I think are obviously his most well-known and most celebrated. And I feel like the other two that I've seen are probably, if you were to kind of make a Mount Rushmore of his movies, those are probably going to be the ones that are being included, although obviously some other ones like Ron or Ikaru or Hidden Fortress are probably other ones that people talk about. I really want to watch The Hidden Fortress because that was like one of the main inspirations for George Lucas to make Star Wars. So I'm really kind of curious to sort of see what parallels there are for that.
That's true.
Yeah.
Honestly, like at this point, you just have to list all the Kurosawa movies and be like, I need to watch this.
Basically, yeah. I think he's got about 20, 25 movies or something like that. And basically everyone's like, oh yeah, I definitely need to watch every single one of them.
Yeah, you know what? I should do that and make my father proud. Just watch everything.
Absolutely. Now what happened next in Japanese cinema is probably my least knowledgeable area. After the golden era of Kurosawa and Ozu, Mizoguchi, and others, what sort of was happening in the industry at the same time that, the American studio system was also falling apart in the 1960s. So I'm sort of curious to sort of see what Japan was doing in that time period as well.
Okay, so it has to start with 1953. No, it has to start in 1953 when television started getting popular in Japan. People were obsessed with this new technology, this box in the house, right? So as television became widely spread in that country, people just didn't go out to watch cinema. So film industry suffered a lot financially in the 70s and 90s. And within the film industry, they were like, we need to ask the government to help us financially. But the head of the Japan Filmmaker Guild said, nah, we just got to make good movies. Like instead of, getting financial support, which is like a typical Japanese, like patriarchy, men. I don't want to generalize everything, but it's like, oh, that sounds like what my grandpa would say. So they kept suffering, even though they suffered. I have to mention Tampopo, which was made in the 80s, directed by Itamizuzo. I'm actually traumatized by that movie, but
really, that's one I really want to see.
You have to watch it. There's this weird food sexual context scene. I watched it as a teenager with my father, so it was awkward. And my dad's just like, "This is one of the best Japanese films. You have to watch it." I'm like, "But Dad, I don't want to watch it with you. I have to watch it again alone." But so even though financially people suffered in that industry, some people kept going and worked hard, and some movies did get international recognition. So it all paid out in the 90s, but it's just this 30 years of just let's keep on trying, making good movies without getting any financial help. We can do it, but not really. So I actually feel bad, but it's just so stereotypical Japanese.
Interesting.
Don't ask for help.
It's interesting because, like, you try. I mentioned off the top this article from the BFI about the best film from every year, and so obviously they do list the movies in through this whole period. But if you're sort of looking at lists of greatest Japanese films of all time or Japanese films I should watch, obviously it's like very heavily skewed for like the 1950s, 1940s, stuff like that. That was happening on all the Kurosawa era, golden era, and then it seems to sort of skip a huge bunch. And then by the time the late 80s come around, that's where these similar names are happening, and we're going to talk about it right next. But like horror and stuff like that. But then the more modern stuff, it just sort of seems to be like this giant gap of like, and nothing of great importance was made for about 30 years.
Yeah, it's dark time.
So as I just said, you can't really talk about modern Japanese cinema without talking about the rise of horror films. It's such a popular genre, and you couldn't name an American film that was remade in English for a period of time in the 2000s. You have stuff like The Ring, The Grudge, and Pulse, which were all originally Japanese movies. And then other now classics, which was stuff like Battle Royale and Audition and House. Most of these movies have either ghosts or supernatural in common, and if not heavily influenced the torture porn subgenre that we know today. What was really this cause of horror in Japan?
Well, first of all, horror stories, scary stories, ideas of ghosts, spirits are just so commonly embedded into the mindset of people in Japan. You grew up with hearing stories of ghosts. Like during summer, around mid-August, there's this period where apparently like ancestors come back to life, or actually the spirits, ghosts come back and visit you kind of thing. So during that time, people always talk about, ooh, I can feel the ghost, blah, blah, blah. So ghosts have been part of practices of Japan, and people just love to think about this unimaginable things and just get scared. And yeah, I don't know why they like being scared, but there are so many books and novellas that I read that are really scary, still haunt me. And I read that through school, and I couldn't really avoid, but it's just part of the everyday life.
Interesting, yeah.
In Japan.
Ghosts and sort of supernatural stuff is basically the one real no I have with horror movies, where I just can't do it because like whether it's monsters or people or things like that, you can explain it away. You could be like, oh, and this is how this was created. Whereas ghosts, they just sort of appear and disappear, and it just does not sit well with me. And playing with silence and sudden noise and stuff like that. Like my wife really wants me to watch The Others with her because she loves that, and I'm just like, no, I can't do that. It's ghosts. I can't do that. Yeah, and so it's just something with that. And like I know not all Japanese horror films are ghost based, but a good chunk of them are. So that's why I've been like so hesitant to be like, oh, go into that. So yeah, that's my sort of mental block. I'm a big chicken, basically.
I don't blame you though. I can't do horrors, but especially Japanese horrors, I refuse to go into it.
Now, you tried very hard to pressure me to watch Ringu. Why did you try to do that?
Because it is iconic, and it is so much better than the Hollywood remake of Ring. I actually laughed. I was laughing the whole time when I was watching the Hollywood remake of Ring. So if you have seen that, you will appreciate the beauty and the complexity and how realistic it is, as in you could find this random video VHS tape and get cursed and you might die. It's just the closeness to everyday proximity that you have. And yeah, it is scary. It still haunts me, but it is entertaining as well. It captures you 100,000%.
Now, my problem is I don't want to be captured by the videotape, so I don't think I can watch it.
That's fair.
Now, have you seen any Takeshi Miike films? Because I know Audition is like held up in very high regard in the horror community, and I often see a lot of people talk about it. And I've, because I'm not a big horror person, I decided to read the Wikipedia summary of it, and I'm like, yeah, there's no way in hell I'm ever watching that movie.
Actually, Miike, I've seen one of his movies, but that's because it was a live action adaptation of this game series that I love, Yakuza, which wasn't the greatest film. I actually didn't like it that much. And I told my friend who is a set decorator in Japan, and she said, Miike is a bit wacky. I don't think you will like it. So I know that people love Audition, and I want to try it, but at the same time, I feel like my body's just not gonna agree with the style of Miike. But maybe I should try it just to scare myself and traumatize myself for a decade.
I think because it's so much about body horror, which is also it's a bit of a tougher thing, no pun intended, to stomach.
Yeah. Very true.
It's just so much more visceral, and it's just that's also another bit of a block for me. I want to watch more David Cronenberg films, but I know so much of that is body horror. I'm just like, I don't know if I'll be able to do that. So I try to do more of his psychological thrillers, not so much his straight up horror-y stuff.
Oh, you don't like the blood and the guts hanging out of people's body?
Yeah, I think it's like doing things to the body that freak me out, just like, some, action or war movies where like, you get shot or stabbed and, someone's intestines fall out. I can deal with that, but it's like the doing things to someone, especially if they're still awake or conscious.
Oh, yeah. You feel the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Meek is very good at that. He loves blood and being grotesque. Yep. He's known for that. I think I read some reviews or comments on his films, and someone in Japan said, like, why does he have to make it so messy? Like, everything is so messy. Like, why? Like, it's unnecessary. And I'm like, that sounds like a good description of his films.
Yeah, absolutely. One that I really do want to check out is House. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it seems really interesting because it was made in the 70s and it has like this very psychedelic vibe to it. And the director basically realized that kids could come up with scarier things that don't make sense than adults can. So he basically got his kids to co-write it with him, where he was like, hey, tell me what you think a scary story is. And then he like basically made it, but with like psychedelic vibes to it. So it really trips you out while also being a little nonsensical about a haunted house and a psychedelic cat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's one that I really want to watch. And it has like a very iconic poster. And every time I see it, I'm like, oh, I really want to watch this because the poster is so cool. I think it's like the poster made for the Criterion edition where it just looks so interesting. So it is one to watch, but I don't know enough about it. If I know I'll really be able to vibe with it, I'll have to see. I feel like horror movies need a different kind of rating system of like what kind of horror it is. So like
how scary or
like what kind of scary is the sort of thing like something like Midsommar. I really enjoyed it. I liked it. And like, yeah, it freaked me out a little bit, but I was able to handle it because it was much more of the, the psychological, and every once in a while there'd be some, some graphic violence and stuff like that, but I can handle that. But it wasn't like, and then a ghost comes in and, the person watching it has a heart attack because they can't handle scary movies, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Funny that you mentioned Midsommar because as I was doing my research on J-horror, I kept going back to Hereditary and Midsommar. Like, I think Ari Aster's movies kind of remind me of J-horrors. And I think I read his comments saying like, oh yeah, I got inspired by classic Japanese films. I'm like, oh, now I see how he establishes the calmness and the intense scare, but not necessarily the typical Hollywood jump scare where you see the threat or you know what's coming. So it's like, oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, because I liked Hereditary as well. That was probably maybe one of the scariest films I've ever watched, so I definitely had to watch that on with the lights.
Oh,
Yeah.
actually, I still think about what was the name of character Toni Collette played? Like she was on the corner of the ceiling.
Oh, God.
Whenever I go to sleep, I think she's like right above me.
Yeah, and especially because I have a thing for spiders as well, and the way she like crawls up the wall just was very spider-like.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, like that scene really reminded me of some Japanese horror films because I forgot which one was it. Maybe it was Ringu, but like you see the threat that's coming close to the main character, but the main character's not realizing it, and you're like, oh no, it's coming. It's happening. That build up is so well done in J-horrors, and that's why I think it's really scary because you're like, run, girl, run, but you can't do anything about it.
Okay, so if anyone listening who based on what I was just saying knows what I maybe would be able to handle or not, and has something that they think that I might be able to stomach, let me know, and I'll dip my toes into the water ever so slightly.
Just watch Ringu.
Yeah,
please.
No, I will not. Sorry, I'm sorry, I will not do that.
No.
Yeah. Now, outside of horror, modern Japanese movies sort of seem to be returning to their roots of quiet and meditative works, led by the likes of Hirokazu Koreeda, who won the Palme d'Or and was Oscar nominated for Shoplifters a few years ago, and his other movies like I Wish and like Father and Son. How is he viewed as the current contemporary to many acclaimed directors in the world?
それ食べさせたら返してきなよ。
今日外寒いんだよな。
キャキャだね。
ねえ、誘拐である。どう見ても。
めっちゃ可愛いじゃん。
In Japan, he is kind of he's respected for sure. And I think that is fair and very accurate. He's the one who's leading the Japanese film industry and saying we have to look at the world, actually go out and make films for not just for Japan, but outside of, Japan. And I respect him a lot. And not just because he's a great filmmaker, but he actually, when he came to TIFF, you've attended TIFF, so but before the screening, the program coordinator always say, we're on this land of this band of indigenous community, acknowledging the land that we're on, basically stolen land. And Koreeda actually tweeted about that, saying it is very respectful, and we all come like afterwards, like we are on someone's land, and I think we have to keep that in our mind. And it's like, oh, he understands the importance of acknowledging this. So I'm just really looking forward to like his upcoming projects.
Interesting. Yeah. Shoplifters was a movie I liked. I didn't love it as much as some other people did, but like I really did enjoy what he was doing. It was kind of a drama, but also kind of a comedy at the same time too, and ending with a very bittersweet note. For anyone who hadn't seen it, it's about this family who makes their living basically stealing, who find a small child and don't quite steal him, but don't exactly give him back to their family because they find him outside of this arguing couple's house or something like that. And so they sort of raise him as a little shoplifter. And so it's very interesting. It's cute at times, and of course there's some sadness when obviously the family eventually has to do the right thing by the child. But I definitely appreciate it. And you're talking about this idea of Koreeda saying that Japan needs to make movies not just for the Japanese audience, but for the worldwide audience. I would almost have to counter and be like, but do they? Because you look at someone like Bong Joon-ho, who made Parasite and was very explicitly a Korean film about Korean customs and culture and things like that. And, on the surface, it really doesn't relate to North American or American sensibilities in any sense. But at the same time, this idea of the human condition is sort of universal, regardless of if it takes place in Korea or if it takes place in America. if you just, does Koreeda really feel that the need to cater to different audiences as much, or I'm just sort of, that's something where I'm questioning a little bit.
So, in order to, go into that conversation, we actually have to look at the current Japanese film industry, like what they're filming, what they're screening, and most of the live action films, the stories are pretty much like the repetition of what's been out there. It's been criticized harshly by so many film reviewers or filmmakers in Japan. It's just that, oh, there's a movie coming up. Oh, the girl's sick and the love interest doesn't know that she's sick and blah, blah, blah. Like someone's either dying and they try to hide it, or someone's just losing something. It's really predictable, apparently, like, all the movies. So like Parasite would not be made in Japan in this current climate. Unfortunately, they just don't have the guts to do something that they're not comfortable with. And Koreeda actually points that out. It's like they know what works, what makes money in Japan, and they just don't want to go outside of that. So in order to break the mold, they do have to look outside of Japan, saying, this is what's happening outside of Japan. What can we do differently here? But I definitely do see your point too. Like it's not necessary to have foreign interests in your mind all the time. Like you don't have to do that. But it's the same old stuff being made over there apparently. So someone has to say, you know what, no more of this. Let's do something.
Do you almost feel that there's maybe sort of two sides to the Japanese industry, where you have, the type of movies that you're talking about that are, will do well at the box office and will make their investment money back and that sort of thing, that will never really, anyone outside of Japan or Japanese descent will ever really watch. And then you have people like Koreeda who makes films that maybe are either more personal or more about the human condition in general, which makes him more internationally acclaimed. Whereas, you can kind of use someone like Bong Joon-ho as a contemporary example, where it doesn't matter that the film is in Korean or it takes place in Korea about Korean people. The fact is that people from outside of South Korea will be able to watch it and understand what he is trying to go for. Do you think that these are two completely different, separate entities working or even fighting against each other in the Japanese film industry?
I do have to say that I personally feel like it is separated, because there's some directors like Kiyoshi Kurosawa and Naoko Ogigami that I know their name because their films, some of their films like Kamome Shokudo by Naoko Ogigami are well received in Europe. And so they do have people who can make films. Okay, that sounds really wrong, but who can make films that can break the mold. But they don't realize that, or the whole industry doesn't realize that, because the other half that keeps making the same kind of movies are okay with the fact that they're just going by this formula. So it's two separate sides that are kind of intertwined in the middle, but it's kind of polar opposite that I hope that it changes soon, because I feel like the industry is kind of limiting itself, saying like, let's just make money, get the investment back, and like with the Japanese audience, you can try out and see how it goes and then bring that money back and invest in more people. I wish that happens, but it's apparently not happening. So it's sad to see the separate sides kind of fighting against each other a bit.
Interesting. Now, I guess one of the last main subjects I kind of want to touch on is something that was discussed on my recent episode celebrating Asian American cinema with Rachel Ho, and that's sort of American films set in Japan. There's stuff like Memoirs of a Geisha, The Last Samurai, Letters from Iwo Jima, and Silence that are about real-life Japanese stories or stories that was happening over there. And then you also have films like Lost in Translation, The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, which used Japan as a backdrop to tell the stories of mostly white Americans and sort of fish out of water scenarios. How are these movies received by the Japanese movie-going audience?
Okay, in order to answer that, let me just explain how kind of complex Japan's idea of Japan being accepted by the world or appreciated by the world, while acknowledging the stereotypical or how the world views Japan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
So Japan likes it when people talk about Japan, like people outside of Japan talk about Japan. They're like, ooh, like people know about us. Ooh, people think that we're cool. Woo, woo, woo. But it's cute in their own way. But they do know that this stereotypical image of Japan's portrayed. And they are kind of okay with that because they know that that's not the reality. Because they live there, they know that, oh, this is fiction, and fiction should be appreciated as a piece of fiction. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yay, they're talking about something. They're talking about Japan, but it's this fictional Japan, but it's still Japan. So it's good kind of thing. With that being said, some of the movies about Japan that depict Japan in the stereotypical way, I just cannot deal with.
Yeah, so I guess like the one that we talked about on the Asian American cinema was Memoirs of a Geisha, which, is a all Asian cast about all Japanese, mostly Japanese characters, despite the fact that not all the actors are Japanese. A good chunk of them are Chinese or from other places in East Asia. Is that a movie that is, it's a very Hollywood film. Is that a movie that did well there or was received at all? Because I remember reading up a bit after it that the person, the actual geisha that the story was based on, I think sued them or something like that because it was so radically different.
Yeah, she sued him. The author, I don't know how that went, but the movie itself, the reviews were, oh my god, the way that they depict Japan is so incorrect. The way that kimono's worn, or just everything, every minute detail was apparently really wrong. I cannot watch that movie because I just can't. Chinese actress playing a Japanese role where there are some Japanese actors who could have played that role. So it's just, I'm avoiding that movie. And then knowing that they just kind of butchered the depiction of Japan, I'm staying away from it. I think box office wise, it didn't do that badly. But the reviews that I checked are just like, yeah, this is a really fictional, kind of fetishized Japan that are really incorrect. So, woohoo, kind of reaction.
Interesting. Now, I remember, behind the scenes revealing stuff. We obviously emailed each other a whole bunch talking about this topic. When I mentioned, or I believe you had mentioned Silence, and you had some thoughts on it. So I definitely want to hear your expanded thoughts on that Martin Scorsese film.
Do you really want to hear it? Do you really want? Are you ready? I'm going to rant.
I wasn't very crazy about that movie, so I don't think you're going to offend me with it.
Okay, before anything, The Silence, the original novel by Shusaku Endo, that novel changed my life. So that book is really important to me. With that being said, I hated The Silence so much. And I hated it after a second into the movie because it is clearly not shot in Japan. And the fact that Scorsese, the worldly renowned director, didn't go extra miles to make believe that it is actually happening in Japan. It pisses me off so much. I'm sorry, Scorsese, you can kill me, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say. But I do have to say that he did a great job with casting because unlike Memoirs of Geisha, he cast I think all Japanese actors. Some of them were even comedians that I knew. So when they popped up, I'm like, what are you doing here? Why? So that was really I think that's the only good thing that I can say about that film. And the fact that they changed the ending, it's really different from the original novel. So as a hardcore fan of Endo Shusaku, I was like, nope, I just can't do it. Yeah.
Do you recall how the novel's ending was different?
I don't want to spoil it.
Okay.
Everyone should read it. Like, I'm begging everyone to read the novel. It is really good. And it's, yeah. And the fact that, like, the original novel, you can kind of predict where it's going, but Endo's writing style is really dramatic, and it captures just, like, the emotions that you feel through his words and between the lines. It's so great, but Silence, I just couldn't get into it. Is it because I'm forgetting his name, Andrew Garfield? He was way too pretty to play that role.
He was the biggest reason why I didn't care for it. I thought he was miscast.
Yeah. Like, every single time I saw him, I'm like, girl, you pretty. Like, no. Like, I was picturing somebody else completely. Even Liam Neeson could have played the role. Yeah, so I was just like, no. Yeah, that movie. But I actually checked some reviews on Japanese websites, and people are saying, like, oh, like, Scorsese did his own take of the novel, so it's pretty good. Yeah. So I was surprised that it was well received in Japan, and people pointed out that the Japanese actors, their English, is heavy with Japanese accent, and the fact that he didn't hide it, like, they kind of embraced that. People really like that. So you know what? I'm happy that they're happy with that, but no, that movie, no.
Okay. Good to know. I guess sort of, the last thing I really want to talk about is, like, are there any movies that we didn't get a chance to really talk about that you want to maybe mention as some of your favorites? For me, there's two in particular, and that would be, I hope I say this correctly, Harikiri and Lady Snowblood, both of them being samurai films, but being so completely different. I watched Harikiri, and it just sort of blew my mind in the same way that Seven Samurai did, and that you can take this, what ostensibly is a very slow moving story of a guy just talking to a courtroom full of people, like a courtyard full of people, and slowly unraveling this, weave of a story about how he's there to kill himself because he's a samurai who can't get work. And then slowly we learn that his son-in-law did the same thing before, and we learn what their relationship is and why he did that and how he was doing it to provide for his own son. So it was one that, like, the way it unfolded really blew my mind. And then, of course, at the very end, it actually becomes like a typical samurai movie where you've got the sword fighting scenes, and they're so well done that I just couldn't help but be impressed with all of that. Is that a movie you had seen before?
No, I haven't, but now you are making me want to watch it, so I will definitely watch it within a month.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. And yeah, the other one that I mentioned there was Lady Snowblood. I'm watching it, and, like, within, like, the first, like, half an hour or so, I'm like, man, this really feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie. And I hop on IMDb on my phone, and I'm reading the trivia, and sure enough, it's like, and this is the main inspiration for Kill Bill. I'm like, of course, exactly. Now I get it.
Yeah, that movie. I haven't seen it. I feel like I'm a failure because I haven't seen some of the most iconic films made in Japan. But I've seen some of the scenes from that movie, and the original and the remake ones, and I was like, damn, that's cool. And I love a good female leading films, so it is definitely on my list. And I love some Tarantino vibe. I mean, it's the other way around, right? It's Mizoguchi vibe that inspired Tarantino, but I love that kind of atmosphere and dynamics, so I will definitely watch it.
Yeah. So yeah, are there any other Japanese films that we didn't get a chance to talk about today that you either highly recommend or have a deep affinity for?
Actually, I haven't seen this film yet, but it's called, I'm gonna butchered it so hard. Thermae Romae. In Japanese, it's called Terumae Romae. It's about this. I don't know what it's even about, which is kind of weird to say, but it's actually a film adaptation of this comic series, and it's about Roman Empire back in the days, and it's about spa, so bathhouse, and it ties into this Roman bath culture and Japanese bath culture, and it's a comedy, and apparently it's really well made, and the main actor, Abe Hiroshi, I grew up watching his films, and he is a really good actor, but he's just only known in Japan, and I feel like it's a shame because he has depth, he has range. So I heard that this movie shows his talent and skills, so I hope people watch them and make him popular like Ken Watanabe, and yeah, one day he will just randomly appear in a Hollywood film.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, I guess people are probably spent the entire episode screaming that we once didn't touch on animated films, a style that Japan has made all their own. And that's because this is an epic 2-part series, and you're going to be back in a few weeks on part 2 of us celebrating Japanese cinema. Was it hard biting your tongue not to bring up things like Studio Ghibli or Akira?
I'm bleeding. Like, my mouth is bleeding right now. I've been, yeah. My tongue's bleeding, my cheeks are I'm bloodbath over here. It's like Mike. Yep.
So people can be rest assured we are going to do a full episode all about animation and anime and talking about that. And this is I'm very excited because this is a genre I know very little about. So I'm very excited for you to kind of teach me what you know about that. And it's funny, I have a podcasting friend, Paulo Batista, who hosts the Oscar Death Race podcast. And he found out that I was doing this, and he's like, "Oh, do you need me to come on for the anime episode?" Because he has an anime podcast as well. And I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to hold off on that. But what I'm going to do is we'll probably do something later along the lines. But I know he's excited to kind of hear what a beginner noob like myself probably thinks of some of the classics.
I'm excited to hear. Yeah, like I agree with him. Like I'm excited to hear your thoughts on Japanese anime and educate you on what's going on there or what has been going on over there. So I'm so looking forward to that episode myself.
I'm woefully underprepared. I'm very excited to finally watch Totoro and Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle and Akira and all the other classics.
I'm so excited for you. You will love it. If not...
Sure I will.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Now, Naomi, I want to thank you for joining the show today and sharing your expertise and your personal stories. You've taught me so much already, and I hope people enjoy listening to this episode as much as I did making it with you. Now, if people want to follow your work, what is the best way to find and follow you?
You can follow me on YouTube. Just search me, my name, Naomi Wada Platt, Platt. I talk about Japanese politics, movies, not just Japanese movies. I actually talk about pretty much everything, but I've been focusing on Japanese politics and news. So hopefully my videos can help those who want to know why some of the Japanese films are the way that they are. I hopefully can provide some answers to that. But yeah, YouTube's the best way, and Instagram and Twitter, the same handle, Naomi Wada Platt. So just, yeah.
Well, you're certainly a great follow, and I'll make sure to link to all that stuff in the show notes.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I had so much fun.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Now stay tuned for next week when we preview what movies we're most looking forward to in the new year with, as I just mentioned before, Paulo Bautista of the Oscars Death Race podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at ContraZoomPod. Make sure you visit ContraZoomPod.com for all your CZB needs. And today's show is presented by Aesthetic Magazine. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you could rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts, it will be a huge help for us to grow and find new listeners. Thanks for listening.